Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'm Halim Kara from Boğaziçi University's Turkish Language and Literature Department. Today we have gathered to commemorate Nâzım Hikmet's 121st birthday. The Nâzım Hikmet Culture and Art Research Center at Boğaziçi University is pleased to host New York University's Rossen Djagalov. We are delighted that Dr. Djagalov has kindly agreed to speak in celebrating the poet's birthday with us today. I'd like to give you a brief introduction to our guest before he begins his talk. Before that, I'm just letting everybody know that we are recording the talk. Rossen Djagalov is an associate professor of Russian in the Department of Russian and Slavic Studies at New York University. He's an historian of leftist culture, interested in linkages between cultural producers and audiences in the Soviet Union and abroad. Before joining New York University, he taught at Koç University, was a postdoctoral fellow at Penn Humanities Forum, and was a lecturer at Harvard University's History and Literature program. His book, From Internationalism to Postcolonialism, a literature and cinema between the Second and the Third World, published by McGill University Press in 2020, explores the Soviet trace in postcolonial literature, film, and ultimately theory. In his second book project, The People's Republic of Letters, Towards a Media History of 20th Century Socialist Internationalism, examines the relationship between the political left and the various media, including proletarian novel, singer-songwriter performance, and political documentary film that at different times played a major role in connecting its publics globally. He is a member of the editorial collective of the Online Leftist. The title of his talk today is Nâzım Hikmet and Soviet Literary Anticolonialism. The floor is yours, Rossen, and thanks for joining us today. We are, very excited to hear from you. Thank you.
Çok teşekkürler Halim Hoca davet için. Nazım'ın doğum gününde yanınızda olmaktan mutluluk duyuyorum. Ama maalesef ben Türkçemi unuttum. Bu yüzden konuşmayı İngilizce yapacağım. Traces of Magma is the title of Rolf Knight's. Sorry, I will share my screen first. And hopefully. And yes. Traces of Magma is the title of Rolf Knight's book-length annotated bibliography of international leftist literature. The title is even more apt now, 40 years after its publication. Today, this body of texts, its authors, readers, and literary institutions feel precisely like frozen magma. The revolutionary volcano that once threw them into the air with awesome power seems dormant, if not quite extinct. Today's political left is a shadow of its earlier 20th century self. The working class intelligentsia alliances on which it is based have been decidedly severed. The politically engaged literature and culture that once helped connect and unify its incredibly diverse international constituents seems even harder to imagine today. I'm one of the archaeologists who studies this magma. Fortunately, these days it is anything but a solitary exercise. Indeed, it is one of the ironies that unites volcanoes and social movements that these are usually studied when they no longer pose a threat. The slightly confusingly named world literature paradigm has proven immensely helpful for reconstructing the circulation of texts, of leftist texts, across a myriad of national and linguistic boundaries. A new generation of scholars of the Global South, more historically oriented and less hostile to Marxism than earlier post-colonialists, have joined in to reconstruct not only East-West scenarios, but also the anti-colonial solidarities that once connected writers and readers across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. For those of us working on the Soviet front, it has been a particularly exciting time. Over the last decade, scholars like Katerina Clark, Galin Tikhanov, Edward Tierman, Susanne Frank have excavated a whole world of transnational literary pathways, rescued from oblivion many a forgotten leftist writer, digitized the literary magazines on which that literature appeared. Cumulatively, we've done a good deal towards reconstructing what we can call a Soviet Republic of Letters, an international literary field comprising leftist writers, readers, translators, and critics, publishing houses, magazines, and literary organizations which challenged Pascale Casanova's hegemonic, Paris-centric literary world system. My particular work, and this is, and I'll be drawing heavily from this book that Halim Hoxha mentioned, has been on the anti-colonial front of the Soviet Republic of Letters, a front in which Hikmet was one of the key figures, and to which, in many ways, he owes his international fame. Indeed, Hikmet joined that republic at its very inception, and on terms that are worth noting. As a young Turkish poet in Moscow in the 1920s, he was very much seen as a literary representative of what the early Bolsheviks called the East. Of course, this East isn't the same as, say, its Orient, but rather a particular early Bolshevik understanding of it, a space under imperialist oppression and in need of emancipation. And unlike subsequent post-colonial scholars, Bolsheviks had no qualms about representation and were in fact in desperate need for spokesmen for the various suppressed peoples, who would also double as spokesman for communism. And while subsequently Hikmet's role within Soviet literary internationalism multiplied, neither his figure nor his poetry lost this fundamental anti-colonial signification. So what I hope to do in this, what I hope to do today would be to offer an archival reconstruction of Hikmet's journey through the eastern side of the Soviet Republic of Letters, making him our guide through its various stages. Initially, we'll start with his stay at the Communist University for the Toilers of the East, KUTV, in the early 1920s, which was followed by his participation in the International Organization of Revolutionary Writers, MORP, of the late 1920s and early 30s, which was then replaced by the Popular Front-era Association of Writers for the Defense of Culture. In the post-Second World War environment, this movement is revived in the form of the World Peace Council of the early Cold War era, in which Hikmet was once again a participant. And finally, with the Afro-Asian Writers Association of the post-Stalin era. Indeed, despite his early death at 61, despite having spent more than a quarter of his life in prison, and much of the rest in illegal status, Hikmet participated in all the major stages of Soviet literary internationalism. His dramatic disappearance from post-Soviet bookshelves after 1990 will also serve to illustrate the rapid ruination of the Soviet Republic of Letters in the post-Soviet world. So, in August 1958, Hikmet was one of the over 200 writers from Asia and the emerging African nation who arrived in Tashkent, the capital of the Soviet Republic of Uzbekistan. Among the many delegates were some of the major representatives of the interwar non-Western literary left: the African-American thinker and novelist W.E.B. Du Bois, the Indian novelist Mulk Rajanand, the Pakistani poets Sajjad Zahir and Faiz Ahmad Faiz, the Chinese polymath Mao Dun, and Nâzım's KUTV roommate Amy Xiao. Though poorly known at the time, younger delegates at that Congress, such as the Senegalese writer, filmmaker Sembène Ousmane, the Indonesian novelist Pram Toyer, and the Mozambican poet Marcelino dos Santos, would become canonical post-colonial writers. According to most accounts left of the Tashkent Congress of the Afro-Asian Writers, that was really a momentous event. Many called it a literary bandung, a reference to the founding conference of the non-aligned movement in 1955. Unlike the non-aligned movement, however, this one was heavily aligned. Thanks to writers from Central Asia and the Caucasus, the Soviet Union got a seat on the Afro-Asian Writers' table. Inaugurated at that Congress, the Afro-Asian Writers Association was one of several Third Worldist literary formations that emerged in the year of decolonization, competing with the CIA-sponsored Congress of Cultural Freedom, whose interventions into post-colonial literature have become the focus of intense scholarly study recently. Also with literary Maoism, whose history, as we'll see, also intersected with the Afro-Asian Writers Associations, and various more contingent Cold War era literary Third Worldism, such as literary Pan-Arabism, Pan-Africanism, Pan-Latin Americanism. The Afro-Asian Writers Association, however, was by far the longest-lived, most sustained, and probably the best resourced of these. While it never overturned Western literary hegemony, as had been its chief aim, it did create a whole literary field through its institutions. Regular congresses, a permanent Afro-Asian Writers Bureau, Lotus Literary Prize, which was for many years the Afro-Asian Nobel, at a time when very few Afro-Asian writers would receive the actual Nobel Prize, and a literary quarterly named Lotus, Afro-Asian Writings. As an active figure of the interwar Soviet Republic of Letters, and a member of the post-war World Peace Council, Nâzım was one of the doyens of the event. Knowing many foreign as well as Soviet Central Asian and Caucasian writers made him also one of the best connected participants. As Alfina Sibgatulina points out, he also represented the whole Turkish delegation, which consisted of just one person. And as he explains in his Congress speech, it wasn't for lack of interest. There were multiple Turkish writers who had tried to make it to Tashkent, but the Menderes government did not allow them to leave the country. To make them present in the conference, Hikmet populates his speech with the voices of such progressive contemporary writers and critics as Kamal Tahir, Samim Khodjagios, and Sherif Hulusi. Another way Hikmet facilitated Turkish representation in Tashkent was by taking advantage of the moment to convince many Russian language, to convince many Moscow-based magazines and publishing houses to produce translations of his countrymen. 4 years later, in an episode probably familiar to some of you thanks to Vera Tulyakov's memoir, at the second Congress of this Afro-Asian Writers Association in Tashkent in 1962, Hikmet's right to represent Turkey was challenged by a Chinese delegate because Hikmet had come from Moscow and did not hold a Turkish passport. Opening a bracket, the Sino-Soviet conflict resulted in a 5-year near paralysis of the activities of the association in the mid-1960s. Hikmet's multiple visits to China, friendships with Amy Hsiao, Mao Deng, and other Chinese authors did not spare him being condemned as a revisionist. Hikmet's answer to this challenge got him a standing ovation. I think I have the right to represent Turkey as a writer who writes in the language of his people. I hope we have a gathering of writers, not of policemen here. Unfortunately, in Turkey, there is no poet better than me. It is probably also the case that I am the best poet among those who have gathered here. And if I exaggerated a bit or offended somebody, let him come forth and I'll happily shake his hand. Needless to say, nobody came forth. One of the last things, and just to conclude this story of Nâzım's participation in the Afro-Asian Writers Association, which really deserves books upon itself. One of the last things Hikmet wrote before his death in 1963 was a cycle of 10 poets he called Tanganyika Reportage, based on his attendance of the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Conference in the newly independent Tanzania. And this an excellent analysis by Gül Bilgihan of this poetic cycle. But let's go back to the very beginning. Hikmet, if the Afro-Asian Writers Association was really the final stage in his journey through the Soviet Republic of Letters, Hikmet's journey through it began as soon as its first institutions appeared. So in the next 20 minutes, let us follow Hikmet as he takes us through those institutions. The story begins with his 2 years at the Communist University for Toilers of the East, KUTV, established in 1921 in Moscow, which Hikmet joined for a couple of years in 1922. And where he found himself not only near the epicenter of Soviet culture's creative explosion, but also among a whole generation of future African and Asian writers. This at first sight may appear unusual because there was no literary coursework in the curriculum of this institution, which was meant to train on the one hand revolutionaries for the foreign East who were being trained in Marxism and practical aspects of underground work. And on the other hand, it was meant to train cadres for the Soviet East, Central Asia, the Caucasus, the various indigenous people of Russian Siberia and the far north. It is actually for the Soviet group that KUTV was of greater literary significance, but let me limit myself to a few of the better known non-Soviet literary alumni of this university, such as fellow Turks Valer Nureddin, Reşat Fuat Baraner, and Zeki Baraştırmır, the founder of the League of left-wing Chinese writers Jiang Guangji, as well as Hikmet's Chinese friend Amy Xiao, who Hikmet immortalized in the poem Gioconda and Xiao, as well as in Hayat Güzel Shaker Deshim. Also, the Iranian writer Abdul Hussein Hesabi, who remained in the USSR as the exilic leader of his country's Communist Party before being purged together with many other Moscow-based Comintern cadres in 1938. Ho Chi Minh may be better known for other achievements, but also the author of the poetic cycle Prison Poems, written in Kuomintang captivity in 1942. Jomo Kenyatta, a writer before he became independent Kenya's first president, and Najati Sidki, a Palestinian short story writer, literary critic, and one of the major translators of Russian literature into Arabic. Here's how Sidki describes the anti-colonial basis of his friendship with Hikmet. Quoting Sidki, each national group within KUTV had its own activities. The most active was the Turkish group, which was headed by the poet Nâzım Hikmet. He was a young man of 25 when I met him, tall with blonde hair and blue eyes and a ruddy complexion. Constantly moving and full of energy, he used to wear golf pants and a jacket almost fully buttoned up, and would stand among the Turkish students, declaiming revolutionary poems he had composed. The Turkish students, would then move on to a comic performance ridiculing the sultans. Someone would ride around on a broomstick, saluting the people left and right, while his classmates would recite the sultan's anthem in a derisive way. Hikmet invited me to the Turkish students often, and even insisted that I join their group and attend their meeting, since both our peoples, until recently, had been living under the same Ottoman despotism. Some of you will have hopefully read Oyku Târzioglu's book, Nâzım Hikmet and the Poetics of Anticolonialism, where she conducts a number of close readings of the most explicitly anti-colonial poems of the late 1920s and 30s, such as the above-mentioned Gioconda and Xiao, Why Did Banerjee Kill Himself, and Taranta Babu. What I wanted to add was the anti-colonial solidarities they textually represent originated in his interactions with KUTV's veritable Eastern International. In his second stay in Moscow between 1925 and 28, already with a much better Russian and a few published poetry books in Turkish under his belt, Hikmet took part in the first successful effort to institutionalize what had earlier been the fairly utopian vision of a literary international. The International Bureau of Revolutionary Literature, as the organization was called, claimed an international status thanks to a few foreign communist writers residing in Moscow. The East was represented by 3 KUTV students, Nâzım Hikmet, Hamdi Selam, and Emin Roy. In this role, Nâzım participated in organizing the first conference of the International Union of Revolutionary Writers, MORP, which took place on the first anniversary of the October Revolution and brought to Moscow several dozens of, this time, really major, primarily Western writers. For the next 23 years, Hikmet was a rather remote participant in the Soviet Republic of Letters. In prison for most of this period, and certainly not allowed to leave Turkey, he could not travel to MORP's second conference in Kharkiv in 1931. Nor did he participate in MORP's transformation from a militant communist writers organization into a much broader anti-fascist alliance called the Association of Writers for the Defense of Culture. One casualty of this popular front turn of the mid-1930s was the toning down of the organization's early anti-imperialism for the purposes of the Soviet alliance with British and French empires against Nazi Germany. But paradoxically, it was during the mid-1930s that the Soviet Republic of Letters grew massively southward with the foundation of the Progressive Writers Association in India and the large number of Latin American writers drawn into the Soviet orbit as a result of the Spanish Civil War. Still, it is during this period of relative isolation from the Soviet Republic of Letters that Hikmet's reputation within it was established. In 1932, his first Russian language book of poetry, translated by the major poet Edward Bagridsky, was established. This was soon followed by by publications in France and elsewhere, usually in leftist presses. His newly acquired status as an international leftist poet, something he obviously lacked during the 1920s, resulted in his election, in his absence, to the Executive Bureau of the Anti-Fascist Association of Writers for the Defense of Culture in 1937. I have no idea whether that was right, but the Soviet archives suggest that this election played a fateful role in his imprisonment by Turkish authorities in January 1938. The nearly 13 years in prison that followed coincided with a major hiatus in the activities of the Soviet Republic of Letters. The purges of 1937-38, the zigzags of Soviet foreign policy culminating in the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact and the partition of Poland and the Baltics forced many foreign participants in the Soviet Republic of Letters to withdraw from it, and the Soviet cultural bureaucracies themselves to pull the plug on most of its initiatives. The Second World War cut off most of whatever cultural linkages had remained, and the immediate post-war period did not see their restoration, especially when it came to Soviet investment in literary internationalism. In the absence of an international literary organization consolidating the post-war era Soviet Republic of Letters, the pro-Soviet World Peace Council, which was a whole movement, partially fulfilled that role. Although not a literary organization per se, the World Peace Movement provided the main platform through which foreign writers, whether party members or Soviet sympathizers, could cross borders, meet, and address wider publics through the first decade or so of the Cold War. Writers constituted one of the best represented professional groups at the multiple congresses held by the movement and its governing body, the Presidium of the World Peace Council, which included writers like Jean Latif, Ilya Ehrenburg, Jean-Paul Sartre, Pablo Neruda, Louis Aragon, and Diego Rivera. Hikmet was selected to join them in the Presidium of the Council, once again in absentia in 1949, while he was still serving time in Turkish prison. Unlike his previous inclusion, this one was part of an ultimately successful international campaign to free him, which incidentally also resulted in a massive publication effort by numerous leftist presses as well as the Soviet Union. So you see that Hikmet's international publications really skyrocket after 1950. When he did escape Turkey in 1951, Hikmet took up his hitherto vacant seat at the Presidium, and therefore his place in the leftist literary international. The peace movement's importance peaked in the last years of Stalin's rule. Once the new Khrushchev government intensified its foreign policy outreach to both the West and the decolonizing East, the Soviet Republic of Letters was relaunched and reconfigured. In the first place, investment in literary internationalism, translation and publications, sending and hosting writers was multiplied. Secondly, new and specifically literary institutions were established, extracting the Soviet Republic of Letters from the broadly public intellectual and political world peace movement. And finally, reflecting the Cold War division of the world into three blocks, the previously singular Soviet Republic of Letters was divided into three geopolitically defined bodies: a Soviet bloc literature, Soviet-Western literary relations, and Soviet engagements with former colonial literatures concentrated in the Afro-Asian Writers Associations. On top of these three internationalisms, of course, there was also the domestic ones of the multinational Soviet literature itself. In his last years in Moscow, before his untimely death in 1963, Hikmet participated in all these literary internationalisms. As a member of the World Peace Council, he made multiple trips to Western European capitals, meeting numerous writers wherever he went. As a Polish citizen over his last decade, a frequent contributor to the Leipzig-based Bizim Radio, as well as who also spent many months trying to help the Bulgarian state persuade its Turkish ethnic minority of its good intentions, he was also a frequent sight in East European cities. Through his engagements with Azeri, Tatar, and other Turkic literatures of the USSR, he also played a role in the literary friendship of the Soviet peoples. And finally, there was the organization that claimed most of his energies in the last 5 years of his life, the Afro-Asian Writers Association, with which I started. Hikmet's place in the Soviet Republic of Letters, however, was not limited purely to foreign relations. Especially after his third and final move to Moscow in 1951, he enjoyed a genuine popularity with the chief reader of that republic, the Soviet audience. Indeed, his absence from the USSR during most of the Stalin era had rendered him a Rip Van Winkle of sorts, a Leninist from the 1920s who had come back to the Moscow of 1950s, and was thus in many ways a socialist with a human face before that became the dominant structure feelings of the late 1950s and 60s in the USSR. The 1956 staging and subsequent banning of his anti-Stalinist play And Was There Ivan Ivanich, for example, was one of the major literary events of the first political thaw of 1955 and 56. Members of an older generation of Muscovite intelligentsia still remember the minor cult around Hikmet and the young poets crowding his hospitable apartment during the thaw era. In a less obvious way, he also participated in the legitimation of free verse in the Russian poetry of the period. It is quite hard to compress the very elaborate argument the Russian poetry scholar Yuri Erlitsky has made to this effect, but basically, in the 1930s, the Soviet cultural authorities had effectively banned free verse, declaring it, quote, an instantiation of the total crisis of imperialist culture. The complication, which became particularly acute after the Second World War, was that the best-known foreign communist poets, such as Neruda, Aragon, Eluard, and Hikmet, were all writing in free verse and really did not like it when their poetry was being artificially metered and rhymed in Russian translation. So already in the late Stalin era began all sorts of compromises that eventually led to the admissibility of free verse, first in translation and subsequently in original Russian poetry. And it has to be said, you know, this movement towards free verse was very much led by translators. Today, unfortunately, this interest in Hikmet that Soviet readers, writers, and scholars once had is no more. If every year between 1951 and 1990, several books of his poetry and prose would be published in print runs, sometimes 15,000-20,000 copies, only to sell out from the bookstores within a few days. For the last 33 post-Soviet years, there have been only 3 book-length publications of his writings in Russian, most of them made possible with private or public Turkish donations. Hikmet's disappearance from contemporary Russian bookshelves and literary culture actually began even before the end of the Soviet Union. Even in the late 1970s and 80s, when he still figured prominently in Soviet publishing houses' plans, his socialism with a human face, the socialism with a human face he embodied, increasingly rubbed the wrong way the anti-communist, the elite anti-communist Moscow and Petersburg based intelligentsia. As the author of the preface to Vera Tulyakova's Hikmet biography, the contemporary Russian writer recalls that the very epithet poet communist attached to Hikmet then made him shiver in the mid-1970s, and when he, meaning Dmitriev, finally read Hikmet after many years, he discovered, much to his amazement, that Hikmet was actually a good writer despite his politics. Indeed, this is probably the most charitable reception Hikmet got from this milieu, which in the 1990s became misleadingly known as in Russia as the Democrats, and in 2000 as the Liberals. Given that the post-Soviet cultural sphere has been largely an arena of struggle between them and the equally anti-communist Russian nationalists, I hope it's obvious why there is almost no place for a figure like Hikmet in post-Soviet Russia. Of course, the story is more complicated than this. In Azerbaijan, for example, where he had spent many months, the interest in him never went away, though, judging by the introductions I've read, Azeri readers' enduring love for Hikmet is usually explained in pan-Turkic terms. He's treated as a symbol of Azeri-Turkish brotherhood. His inconvenient communism is in the process swept under the rug. Moreover, there has been some new and exciting scholarship on Hikmet by Russian Turkologists, such as Polina Vrutina and Elfina Stipgatulina. In a regular philology department, however, Hikmet would not be considered an author to study, despite his major place in Soviet literary history. In this sense, Hikmet's fortunes in Russia are illustrative of the broader provincialization of post-Soviet literature, which has cut its Soviet-era linkages with non-Western literatures. I will end this talk with an account of the ruination of the Soviet Republic of Letters, at least as far as the Soviet anti-colonial axis is concerned. A few years ago, I was invited at to give a talk at Moscow's Institute of Oriental Studies, an institution with a glorious 150-year-old history. My hosts from the Department of the Literatures of the East thought it necessary to apologize for the low attendance. If in 1990, they explained, the department had employed over 40 researchers, now the number was less than 10, with almost all of them were into retirement age. The physical deterioration of the buildings of the Moscow-based institutes of Oriental Studies, of African Studies, of Latin America testifies to post-Soviet Russia's general loss of interest in the non-Western world. The rich area studies knowledge they had generated during the Soviet period, which fully competed with and in some areas bested US area studies, has given way to post-Soviet Russia's shrunken geopolitical priorities. Gone is also the famous Progress Publishing House, the flagship of Soviet translation efforts. Founded as the Publishing Cooperative of Foreign Workers in 1931, it is peak in the 1980s. It published every year over 2,000 books in 30 million copies, spread over almost 70 languages. A linguistic scale never matched by any press worldwide before or after. Many Indians, Cubans, and Africans in the early 60s, 70s, and 80s grew up with its cheap and beautifully produced translations of children's literature, of the Marxist classics, of Russian and Soviet fiction. For a number of decades, Progress also served as the main publisher of non-Western literature for Soviet audiences. What is left of it now is a gigantic privatized building on Zubovsky Boulevard in Moscow, fading memories, and aging copies in private and public libraries throughout the former Soviet Union. The result is that the once rich ecology of non-Western literature in Russia, imbricated with ideology, though it may have been, has been completely decimated. In the words of the Moscow-based translator Elena Malykhina, if you go to a bookstore today, you'd think that literature today is written only in English or German. There's only a tiny number of representative contemporary writers from the non-Western world that we can find in Russian bookstores. J.M. Coetzee alone stands for the whole of Africa, Orhan Pamuk for West Asia, Salman Rushdie for India, Haruki Murakami and Kazuo Ishiguro for Japan. Most non-Western national literatures are, however, left without a single representative. Importantly, in the absence of significant direct relations between Russia and the contemporary non-Western world, these books and authors reach Moscow only following and as a result of the approbation of publishers, critics, and publics in the West. The end of the Cold War had just as significant repercussions on non-Western literatures as transnational literary networks became profoundly reconfigured. In its heyday in the 1960s and 70s, the Third World Project sought to confront Western hegemony by pooling resources, economic, political, cultural, of the newly decolonized countries and acting in concert. In the realm of literature in particular, its instantiations such as the Afro-Asian Writers Association sought to both raise the status of literature in the two continents as a consciousness-raising tool, and to establish direct connections between writers and audiences from different post-colonial countries, bypassing the imperial metropoles. Thanks to the association's translation initiatives, for example, to read an Indian book in Egypt or a Nigerian one in the neighboring Senegal no longer means necessarily holding a translation published in Paris or London. Since the end of the Cold War, for African, Asian, and Latin American writers, the available room for maneuver has vastly shrunk. No longer is a prominent African writer simultaneously courted by two sets of cultural apparati, Soviet and Western, willing to outbid each other to secure the writer's manuscript, presence, or goodwill. No longer is there any kind of interblock cultural competition that essentially subsidized interest in and publication of these writers in the West or the Soviet bloc. The Cold War was really the best of times for African, Asian, and Latin American literature. With the disappearance of a third worldist or a Soviet audience, as I had tried to show in my book, some of the tropes that I had identified of early anti-colonial novels in the mid-20th century, like the foreign utopia topos, the railway or supply chain narratives, have disappeared from contemporary African, Asian, and Latin American literatures. They've been replaced by plot devices legible to Western audiences, such as migration narratives or memory-based time travel. Moreover, if a contemporary writer from the global South is to achieve an international status today, they have to make the physical journey to the global centers of literary capital, London, New York, Barcelona, or Paris, or at least speak their language. In this hollowed out one world, in the absence of a cultural second and third, post-colonial studies based in Anglo-American campuses has acquired an outsized influence, taking up some of the anti-colonial work of the Afro-Asian Writers Association, but without connections to living movements and with the politics that has often struggled to break out of the university classroom. But this is maybe another story, and it's already taken us too far from Nâzım. So let me stop here, and should you have any questions, I'll be really delighted to answer them.
Thank you very much, Rossen. This wonderful and insightful talk, and your talk basically showed us the importance of looking at texts and writers, in much wider, broader context, such as international. Because as somebody who is in the Department of Turkish Language, we like the national borders a lot. It's easier for us. You underline the importance of circulation of text and relationship between texts in different geographies and cultures. I have a lot of questions actually, but I want I'm going to give the floor to the audience first if they have any questions. Not, I can start. Can I start with your last comment about this? How post-colonial, lots of people have been complaining about it. How post-colonialism is basically centered around, the what you call global capitals, and especially in North America, and how we can overcome this. Since you are doing a study or you are working on this, and I agree with you on that. What can we do about it, and what can, these, writers that you are talking about, both in the Soviet context and international context, and is ironically, anti-colonialist, movement, in literary movement, owns everything, what you call the Soviet Republic of Letters, actually.
Yes, I would very happily answer this question, and we have to acknowledge that today post-colonial studies is undergoing a very reflexive and historical turn, and is beginning to think about its own history and its own lineage in a way that hasn't, that even 5 or 10 years ago wasn't true. In many ways, this movement was initiated by Robert's young book, Post-Colonialism, A Historical Introduction.
Yes.
But literally in the last 5 years, there has been really a lot of historical reflection by post-colonial writers trying to place the origins of their movement beyond, say, its 1979 Orientalism book. Yes, find linkages with Marxist or Soviet literary engagements with the colonial question. We have to bear in mind that post-colonialism emerged in the 1980s out of a certain sense of disappointment with the decolonization project. A disappointment which may be difficult to understand right now, but these post-colonial, the earliest generation of post-colonial intellectuals were seeing the failures of the post-colonial state. They were seeing the dictators that took power in most post-colonial countries. They were seeing the failures of economic or social decolonization, so the post-colonial movement emerges out of the sense of disappointment in the 80s, even if institutionally it really begins acquiring academic positions, centers, and becomes institutionalized only after the end of the Cold War in the 1990s. So there's a bit of a time gap between, say, it's Orientalism and the moment when post-colonialism becomes a major scholarly fashion in the 90s, and everybody becomes a post-colonialist. So, and in a sense, my work has been part of this broader effort to situate it historically and find its numerous lineages. There were certainly others, other than the Afro-Asian Writers Associations, the Soviet version of Marxism, but I think it is really an important lineage that most post-colonial scholars unjustly neglect.
Thank you. This is important because, and as I think is also probably connected, I don't know what you think about it, connected with the disappearing of, Nâzım's, popularity, for example, in contemporary Russia or in post-Soviet Russia. I noticed the same thing actually in other countries. Whenever I go to a different country, I visit a library and look at, if there are any Turkish translations at the libraries. And, you know, over the years, I noticed how, you know, libraries probably stop, you know, having, you know, Nâzım Hikmet's, you know, books in their, you know, collections, you know. Do you think there is any kind of connection with the way that, you know, post-colonial studies going on campuses and disappearing of this, you know, post-colonial, Soviet-connected post-colonial authors, you know, in a way in the West?
No, absolutely. And we have to think of Nâzım's immense international popularity during the Cold War as part of a leftist international culture.
Yeah.
And it was often leftist publishers or leftist magazines who were really most involved in his publications. And once that culture shrinks, as it did in the 1990s, once, you know, and I very briefly mentioned, you know, the transition to these new authors from the global south that contemporary literary globalization favors, you know, writers like Pamuk, you know, whose narratives are much easier for contemporary Western reader to connect to, you know, this
Yes.
nostalgia-based time travel. We see how you know, this type of narrative of also by somebody who is you know, a great writer, but who is spending a significant time of the year in New York. You know, how it is how Pamuk really takes the place of a Nâzım who was really relying on this bloodstream of international leftist culture, which.
True, and when I teach, you know, Nâzım Hikmet to international students, you know, I have to give, you know, wider context in order to have the student, you know, connect themselves or associate themselves with, you know, his poetry. So it's easier for them to read Pamuk or even Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar, which is more difficult for the probably global, you know, readers. It's kind of sad to see that actually students, you know, like when I teach, you know, Kerem gibi, like Kerem, you know, they don't know what I'm talking about.
Yes, because also understanding Nâzım also means understanding a lot of that political and historical context.
Exactly. Yeah.
The part which seems, you know, so distant often to many of our students.
Any questions? Thank you, Rossen. Any questions, comments? I can keep going. It's not a problem. If you don't mind, I ask a couple of more questions. You know, I was fascinated to see the picture from 1958 in Tashkent. You know, they had the Afro-African, you know, Writers Association meeting. And as you know, in the 50s, you know, after Stalin's death, you know, there was so many other things going on in the Soviet Union, you know, the way that they were trying to redefine socialist realism in a way. And, you know, when you were talking about three different, you know, let me see if I can, you know, put this together rightfully. But when you are talking about three different, you know, literary internationalism, you also mention its relation with, you know, multi-Soviet literature. I'm curious about if you can, you know, maybe elaborate on the connection between these two, you know, literatures, you know, three literary internationalism and multinational. Any kind of relation, any kind of connections, any kind of, you know, the dialogue between these realms in a way.
Yes, and because we often confuse the Soviet with Russian.
Exactly.
So often these are used as synonyms, but in fact, Soviet literature, for example, was a literature of over 80 languages and ethnicities, written, and published, across the Soviet Union. So of course, to reduce all this to Russian means to ignore probably half of the literary production of the Soviet Union. And especially, the literature of Central Asia and the Caucasus was very important for Soviet literary connections to the Third World. Practically any Third Worldist event taking place in the Soviet Union, or any delegation of Indian or Pakistani or writers would necessarily be taken to Tashkent, to Samarkand and Bukharan. Maybe Tashkent is particularly important in this context because it was this showcase city for Soviet Central Asian modernity. An incredibly diverse city, which is something that the delegates to the Tashkent Congress, the foreign delegates, never failed to observe. Here if you like in Accra, here if you like in India, they would write upon returning home after the... and also a city with a certain pre-Soviet history, as well as a very modern industrial base with its academies of sciences, with its cultural palaces. And so Tashkent was often the whole city of many further Afro-Asian events. Probably as far as Turkey was concerned, and Turkish literature was concerned, Azerbaijan was even more important, and hence, the time Hikmet spent as a visitor of the Azeri Writers' Union, the multiple translations of him in Azerbaijan. So this, what I mean to say is that Soviet Third World engagements were intimately connected with Soviet multinational literature and culture, and it was often non-Russian, Soviet Central Asian or Soviet Caucasian writers who would be the main main liaisons with Third Worldist writers and filmmakers.
Yes. Thank you. Maybe to follow that one, I was wondering about, you talk about how Nâzım Hikmet wasn't happy with the translation of his works into Russian, actually. I wonder if he, I don't know if he can say anything about it, but, I wonder if he follow his translation, translation of his works into Russian, actually, and how much was he involved in that process? And how much, the other thing, how much, his, work in Russia, because you said that he lost his importance or, popularity later. how much his work was, circulating in the Russian language, for example, or among the Russian, literary intelligentsia, for example.
So about the first question, what his, about his unhappiness with his Russian translations. I mean, obviously, he had especially in the 50s and 60s, very fluent Russian. Some of his prose work, I mean, he did write Was the Ivan Ivanich, in actually mixing the two languages with a Russian collaborator. So prose writing, he could actually produce in Russian. Poetry, of course, was always Turkish, and he was, but he obviously could read it like very, very few other foreign writers. So he, as soon as he arrived in Moscow in I think June or July of 1951, and saw his writing, I think his unhappiness began very early, but at the same time, he was very lucky with his translators, because really it is often the translator who determines the reception of a poet in particular. I think for prose it's less significant.
Yeah.
But for example, if you are being translated by a major Russian writer, Russian poet, as Hikmet was, you have, in addition to your own reputation, the reputation of your translator precedes you, and the reader is much more likely to open a book translated by people like Muza Pavlova or Eduard Bagritsky, or I forget, it's really a whole cohort of Soviet poets who translated Hikmet, who was really one of the most, if not most popular, one of the most popular contemporary foreign poets in the 50s and 60s. Plus this, reputation, his reputation as especially among elites, literary circles in the 50s and 60s, is a figure from the 1920s, a real Leninist, and a genuine enthusiast who wasn't smothered by Stalinism. I think, that image certainly also helped many an elite literary public become warm to Hikmet in the 50s and 60s in a way it no longer was in the 70s and 80s. And sorry, the second question was about...
I forgot my second question, actually. Sorry. Okay. Anybody remembers it? Oh, the circulation of his work among the Russian, literary figures.
Yes. So okay. So I actually answered it for the most part.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, really incredibly popular, and because Hikmet actually worked with, after arriving in Moscow, he did work with his translators, especially those poets who did not know Turkish. There were also translators who translated directly from the Turkish, but for others, Hikmet produced interlinear cribs of a fairly, literal translation that they poeticized, but that process was by nature collaborative, and Hikmet actually knew his translators very well. Yes, and it's also worth saying that in addition to this Russian literary public, his works were being translated into the many languages of the Soviet Union, especially in Central Asia and Azerbaijan.
Yes. Okay. Well, small question about this language question, actually. When you were talking about all those meetings that they had in the Soviet Union, the major language probably they used was Russian among themselves. But my question is not about that, but you can comment on that. My question about, as you also mentioned that Nâzım insisting writing in Turkish. I wonder what other, Soviet, anti-colonialist writers wrote in what their relationship with their native language, for example, in comparison to Nâzım Hikmet in that regard.
Yes, so, all these writers' congresses, as you can imagine, it is like a Tower of Babel.
Exactly, yes.
If probably English, French, and Arabic would be the languages most common to those gatherings, certainly they would not be able to serve everybody who had come, every writer who had come to Tashkent or other such places, but there was a massive translation program, and including, so if you remember the first image of that conference I had with W.E.B. Du Bois, he had his earphones, and
exactly,
so other participants. So there was really a massive translation program. As far as the second question about
native language,
native languages of other non-Russian Soviet writers, they really had a very complicated relationship, and there were numerous trajectories, that about one's relationship to Russian, which was the old Soviet language. Maybe not every citizen of the Soviet Union spoke Russian, but really the vast majority did. So if you are to reach an old Soviet audience with Uzbek or Kyrgyz writer, your best chances are through Russian. Whether if you write in Russian, which would make the process, much more direct one.
Yes.
Or if you are translated into Russian, and that so that immediately multiplies your potential audience, by a factor of a dozen, or depending on where you're from. So that was one of the reasons some Republican writers preferred, who were bilingual, in the first place, prefer to write in Russian, because that automatically assured them a much greater audience, and they weren't subject to the whims of translation. Secondly, and this is true especially, yes, of Central Asian literatures, censorship in Kyrgyz or Uzbek was often much more severe than censorship in Russian.
Yes.
This is one of the explanations often given why probably the best known non-Russian Soviet writer, Chingiz Aytmatov, switched to Russian in the first place, because his short stories, the short stories that he was sending to Kyrgyz publishers kept getting rejected. And even after the Moscow literary magazines and Moscow publishers took upon Aytmatov as one of their favorite writers, even then there was a good deal of hostility against Aytmatov and resistance to him in his native Kyrgyzstan, and his famous, one of his most famous short stories or novellas, Jamila, which was Louis Aragon, famously described as the world's most beautiful love story. That was condemned fairly officially in Kyrgyzstan because, quote, it offended the honor of the Kyrgyz women. The Kyrgyz woman cannot be unfaithful to her husband, because the story is premised on Jamila's infidelity to her husband, but her fidelity to art so yes. So it's to summarize, it's a very long and complicated story, and obviously towards the end of the Soviet Union, in the late 90s, in the late 80s, the dynamics were very different as many Soviet writers tried to become national writers and rejected the Russian language, or conversely, they felt that they were really Soviet writers, and now that there's no Soviet Union, there's only Russia and Uzbekistan, for example, there's really no place for them. And so Aytmatov may be one of these cases, he ultimately, spent the 90s in Brussels.
Yes. One last question, if you permit me. Is that okay?
Of course.
Thank you very much. When we look at your biography, you consider yourself a scholar who is tracing, who's looking after Soviet traces in different cultures. I was wondering if what you see when you try to explore Nâzım's traces in different literatures, especially in regard to this. You don't have to answer, by the way, in regard to his relationship with contemporary Turkic poets, for example, in the Soviet Union. Any influence, Nâzım's influence on specific poets that you have noticed when you were doing your research? Thank you very much.
I have, it's a difficult question, Halim Hoca. And
I know that. I know it's a difficult question, but as I said, you don't have to answer it. The reason I am asking these questions to probably encourage my students, because
and maybe
Nâzım Hikmet, you have to learn Russian and other, Soviet languages. Because, you know, studying Nâzım just within Turkish context, it will probably do some, you know, it brings some new, you know, insights to his work. But if you look at him, you know, outside, you know, his work outside of Turkish context, you will probably meet, you know, more appealing, you know, work there.
That's really a fantastic point, that to understand Nâzım and especially his influences, you know, one must really work across.
Yeah, it's cross-cultural influence, actually.
Yes.
It's not just within the context of Turkey, which usually that's what we do in Turkey.
But I'm just wondering whether any of the audience members have better answers, really, because
I have one author, one poet in mind is Rauf Parfi of Uzbekistan. When I saw his poetry, I was shocked. It's Nâzım in terms of the language, in terms of the form, and, you know, the content is completely different. It's more international than probably socialist in a way, but at the same time local, but the form and the visuality of his poems, he passed away, I think, but I was shocked to see that the close connection between his poetry and Nâzım's poetry, actually. But other than that, like Azerbaijan is there, we don't look at Azerbaijan and the connection between Azerbaijani poet and Nâzım's poetry. Probably Iran in Azerbaijan, because I know he was published and his work were, you know, circulating among the Azeris in Iran. Thank you very much, Rossen.
Thank you, Halil Hoca.
Thanks for this fascinating and wonderful talk, and thanks for accepting our, you know, invitation to honor Nâzım's, you know, 121st, you know, birthday at Boğaziçi University.
And thank everybody for their patience.
Estağfurullah. And hopefully see you when you come to Istanbul.
Evet.